inhale it in high levels. That is, unless there is a source. It's likely, although not shown, that consistently being exposed to high levels of airborne histamine may have negative health impacts. So while we already know that histamine is abundant in the dust collected behind the bed in infested homes, what's going on throughout the home? How is histamine spatially distributed throughout the indoor home environment? We hypothesized that histamine will be pervasive in settled household dust, bedding material, and in airborne dust. To test this hypothesis, vacuum dust samples were collected from locations within bedbug infested and uninfested units from a multifamily housing structure. 5 locations were sampled, which included the bedding material, the wall behind the bed, the bedroom floor, the kitchen, and the in-unit air filter, which was representative of the airborne dust. These collected dust samples were then sieved and weighed. An internal standard was added and the solution was derivatized. The derivatized samples were then blown to dryness under nitrogen, reconstituted in the solvent, in our case toluene, and analyzed using GCMS. A Mann-Whitney test indicated that without taking into account sample location, infested homes significantly differed from uninfested homes with respect to micrograms of histamine per gram of dust. Histamine quantities from each sampling location were then looked at individually and transformed to meet the assumptions of the statistical test before being compared at sampling location between infested and uninfested homes using a t-test. When infested versus uninfested units are plotted side by side, as seen in this graph, with each sampling location in order of their proximity to the human host and the highest concentration of bedbugs, from right to left on the x-axis, and the micrograms of histamine per grams of dust on the y-axis on a logarithmic scale, overall, we visually can see clear differences between infested in blue and uninfested units in orange. For the bed, the difference wasn't significant, but we do see values from anywhere from 21 to 902 micrograms of histamine per gram of dust in these infested bedding samples. We also have no control over when residents change their sheets or clean their beds, and that all likely explains the lack of significance of the t-test. For the bedroom wall, there was a significant difference, as well as for the bedroom floor. This makes sense, as the bedroom is likely to have the highest concentration of bedbugs producing histamine within the home. People also aren't likely getting behind the bed or around the perimeters of their rooms to clean as often. Vacuum samples taken from the kitchen did not statistically differ between bedbug infested and uninfested units, and they didn't differ for the filter either. But that follows since those locations are farther away from the bedbug histamine source. This study found abundance of histamine orders of magnitude greater in bedbug infested versus uninfested units, which confirms the findings of the 2018 study. The greatest histamine with respect to location was quantified from samples taken from the bedding material, although the bedroom wall and the bedroom floor were the only locations that were statistically significant between infested and uninfested units. Based on the clear differences in means, however, we expect to capture the true variability of the other sampling locations as we increase sample size. We also see somewhat of a trend towards higher histamine quantified from locations closer in proximity to the human host. While histamine seems to be concentrated in those locations, there's still a respectable amount of histamine in the kitchen and coming from the air filter, where there aren't high infestations of bedbugs. Based on this, histamine does appear to be moving throughout the home and spreading from the source. Much is still unknown about bedbug histamine and the role it plays in the indoor home environment. The next steps from this project will be to determine if bedbug histamine has medical relevance and to determine how much histamine is produced by bedbugs at their differing life stages. Additionally, we expect to examine the longevity and stability of histamine on varying indoor surfaces and screen other arthropods commonly found inside the home for production of histamine. So the main takeaways that I'd like to leave you with today are that histamine is between 2 and 50 times higher in bedbug infested versus uninfested homes. And these results seem to indicate that histamine is spreading throughout the home. We expect these differences to become more apparent as we increase sample size. Finally, based on our current findings, the bedroom should be prioritized for histamine mitigation efforts due to those high differences in histamine quantification and the proximity to humans. On average, we spend 8 hours a day and roughly a third of our lives sleeping in our beds. High histamine in these areas likely increase the chance of development of any associated health risks to bedbug histamine. With that, I'd like to thank the Urban Entomology Lab at the University of Kentucky. I'd like to thank NCUE and IPAC for having the student competition and the following funding sources. And I'm happy to take any of your questions at this time. Thank you.
There seem to be a few people who are curious about differentiating the histamines from bed bugs from other sources.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. So within the home, so if you look at this figure, and again, this is on a logarithmic scale, so it's difficult to tease out the differences, but when you look at a linear scale, this is for the filter, it's a very clear difference between infested versus uninfested units that have bed bugs and that don't. So histamine is always going to be significantly higher. At this time, we don't know of any insects or anything else in the home that's contributing. There are some other environmental factors that may be contributing to histamine, but it's always going to be much higher as a result of bed bugs. And so that's how we can see those clear differences.
All right, we have, a few other questions for you for the Q&A session, if you are going to stick around, but